Let me start with a question that I assume maybe you hear a lot. So in my personal feeling, and I don't know if people in the room and online are sharing this, but my personal feeling is that everything is getting worse all the time. And there are more disasters and risks out there. Does the data actually bear this out? So are we truly living in disastrous times, or is this just an impression?
I'm afraid it's not an impression, it's a reality. First and foremost, because of what we call climate change, or what I would call climate emergency. So in the past 20 years, the number of extreme weather events which related to climate change in one way or another has doubled. And actually 90% of major disasters are related to it. Just a few days ago in Japan, where is one of, let's say, the most disaster prepared countries, there was a huge mudslide and more than 60 people are missing. So we are seeing this everywhere. And globally, I'm afraid it is a reality. And that's why we do need to think about disasters, but how we can prevent better.
Now, your office, you just told me before, runs a campaign right now, and the slogan of the campaign is "There are no natural disasters." When I turn on the TV or open a newspaper, that seems not true. So what do you mean by that?
Okay, well, that's a good question, and thank you for the question. So when you listen to the news here or everywhere, the caster would say, we had a natural disaster here or there. But let me explain why there is no such thing as a natural disaster. So think about a storm or a cyclone or even an earthquake that hits no man's land. Nobody is living there, it just goes through. And there is no casualty, there is no economic loss. We call these earthquakes, storms, natural hazards. Hazards, we cannot prevent all of them, especially like earthquakes or even storms. But then when hazard is combined with two other things, exposure, which is, let's say, your house. Your house is there, and if it's knocked down, and if it is combined with another element, which is vulnerability. So let's imagine that two elderly people are living in that house, and one person is disabled, and they cannot evacuate, even if they know that a disaster, well, I shouldn't say that a disaster may occur. Then you have a hazard, an exposure, and vulnerability, and that is a disaster. So you can prevent a hazard from becoming a disaster if you would build your house in a place that is less exposed to, let's say, floods, if you build your house in a way that is more resilient to earthquake, and if we know where the vulnerable people are and provide evacuation routes for them, provide early warning systems with them, then we are reducing the exposure and vulnerability, and a hazard will not turn into a disaster, at least not a major one. So that is what I mean when we say there is no such thing as a natural disaster.
Is a pandemic a hazard or a disaster?
Pandemic is caused by what we call a biological hazard, which is a tiny, tiny virus. And this has turned into a pandemic, which is a disaster. Now, interestingly, Nico, 6 years ago, when the member states of the United Nations got together in Sendai, Japan, and agreed on a document which is called the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction 2015 to 2030, they looked into what are the hazards that are surrounding us. There was a very strong push from WHO and countries that had experienced Ebola, SARS, MERS. And they said, look, the next big thing which is coming is pandemic. So let's put in biological hazard, let's put in epidemics and pandemics in this global document that will guide us until 2030. And let's try to be prepared better. Let's try to be preventive. And it's in there, but the sad thing is that 6 years on, the pandemic has happened as we are all living through it, which means that we didn't do a good job in trying to make that biological hazard become a pandemic.
Let's maybe stay with the pandemic for obvious reasons for a moment.
Yeah.
So we're now, depending on how we count, 15, 16 months into the pandemic as declared by the WHO. I want to hear a little bit. We read so much about the different responses to it, how different countries have fared, and it seems to me that like every 2 to 3 months there's a different narrative emerging. So at the beginning, China was badly hit, then China was doing really well. Then for a long time, most Asian countries were sort of being seen as role models, but now it turns out that maybe it's not that easy, and many of them are struggling. So when you look at this big global confusing picture of pandemic response so far, what are your key takeaways? What has actually worked well? If there are any things that have worked well, we'd love to hear. And what are the things, I think those are probably a bit more obvious, that haven't worked and that should work much better next time. So what are your key takeaways from this ongoing disaster right now?
So interestingly, at the beginning of the pandemic, some of the East Asian countries were doing better, especially Republic of Korea. Why? Because they had experienced SARS and MERS. So they had a test and track system already installed. They used it. They also had a triage system within their public health system, where they would send certain patients who are seriously ill to certain places where they had better facilities or equipment, and others who were not that seriously ill, they had different ways of treating them. So that worked. And as you know, even today, I think the number of people infected and the mortality from this pandemic is fairly low in Republic of Korea, Japan, and some other countries. But as you say, things started to evolve. The irony is that because they were doing quite well in that stage, the rollout of vaccine in these countries was very slow, and it's still very slow. So what is happening now is that while this part of the world, Europe, is starting to get out with the rollout of vaccine cautiously, but rather steadily, those countries are in a challenging time right now. And what is being impacted is health, but also there's a worry that the economy might be impacted more over there, because obviously if you have to close down things or keep restrictions, then you can't open the economy. So that is not working well. So the pandemic has showed us that at each level, we need to be ahead of the curve and understand what can minimize the effect. What I think is not really good at all right now globally is the global rollout of the vaccine. Because of course, in Switzerland, in most of Europe, in the States, the rollout of vaccine has become rather successful. This is something that is a good thing. And of course, before that, what happened was that there was a lot of public money that was invested into the development of the vaccine. And we had a record, quick process of getting the right vaccine. That's great. But when you look at the whole world, the percentage of people being vaccinated in what we call the global south is very, very low. What does it mean? It means that there could be many variants that emerge in these countries. And then even the vaccines that we have right now, that we have been vaccinated with, we don't know whether it's going to work. So unless we quickly vaccinate the whole world, and this is, of course, a humanitarian issue, but it's more than a humanitarian issue. It's about ourselves too. The slogan about this pandemic is that we are not safe until everyone is safe. And unfortunately, it's not going very well. That is something that is very worrying now.
You mentioned before that when the Sendai Framework was created, that the pandemic or pandemics as a risk were front and center. And many people said it was the next thing. Now the next thing has arrived, and we see how how suboptimally we were prepared for this. So in your view, what is the next thing? So what is the next thing that because now we've covered pandemics, and I dare say, and I hope that if another one comes, we're going to be slightly better prepared. But in all likelihood, the next disaster to hit us globally, or at least a big part of the world, is not going to be a pandemic, but something else. So what is keeping you up at night? What are we not prepared for that we should be very much prepared for?
Well, it's climate emergency. It was there before the pandemic. It has gone nowhere. During the past year, many countries, while being challenged by the pandemic, were also hit by disasters related to climate emergency. And the interesting thing is, it is global, right? When disaster risk management started to become a global agenda, and this was in the 1990s, many countries weren't interested in it. Why? Because they didn't live with disasters, especially in this part of the world. Although you may want to know that in the 14th century, there was a big earthquake in Switzerland around Basel. So this is also a country that has experienced some earthquake. But my point is, 1990s, this global agenda started. Europeans, Americans not interested, saying it's not our issue. We have other issues. 2004 Boxing Day, December 25th, what happened? The Indian Ocean tsunami, and a lot of tourists from Europe perished because they had never seen a tsunami. They were looking with fascination when all of a sudden the ocean started to draw back. And there was one girl from Britain, her name is Tilly Smith, who had learned in her geology class that there is a thing called tsunami, and it's deadly. And when it starts, the ocean recedes. So she told everybody, including her parents, that we need to evacuate now. And she saved 100 people's lives. But most Europeans had never seen anything like that. So they were just looking with fascination, sadly, and they perished. Global climate change has changed everything, because no matter where you are, we are hit by disasters related to it. There are wildfires in Sweden, in Siberia. Drought, you may think it's an African thing. It is not. In the Danube area in Europe, drought is becoming a very serious issue. And then when you think about storms and floods, it's happening everywhere. So and I would say that while climate change is the big thing, and if we don't really succeed in mitigating the effects of climate change, what is more terrifying right now is that there are so many things that hit us simultaneously. If you think about 2011, March 11, in Fukushima, earthquake, tsunami, which hit a nuclear power station, which became a huge disaster. This is a combination of different disasters. And that's what's going to happen in many places. So this is what we are facing. And this is why we really need to be better in understanding what are the disaster risks that are surrounding us. Even here in Switzerland, in Zurich, where everything seems to be very orderly, very tidy, very safe, you would like to look at the hazard map of where you live. You would want to look at what happened in the past, but you also want to look at what could happen in the future if the global warming continues. What is going to happen with the amount of rain, the floods and whatnot. So this is where we live. This is the world where we are in. I don't want to sound like I'm, terrifying everybody, but this is the reality. So that's it.
So let's look at the hazard map, because we are the Asia Society, but also so that people here in Zurich don't leave this event completely frightened. Let's maybe look at the hazard map of Asia and not of Zurich to begin with. So we know we've mentioned some of these things. I think one thing people immediately think about when we think of disasters and Asia are earthquakes, and Japan there is very exposed. We've read a lot about wildfires, of course, in Australia. I know Asia is a big and diverse place, but could you talk a little bit of the key risks that you see in Asia, and maybe also whether there are risks that are more pronounced or significantly less pronounced in Asia than there are in other places of the world? So what makes the hazard map for Asia special?
Right. So Asia Pacific is unfortunately the most disaster prone region in the world. And when we talk with people from Japan or Indonesia, they say, okay, we are like a department store of disasters. Why? Because first, geographically, geologically, there's what we call the Pacific Ring of Fire that is in that area. And so they have earthquakes, they have tsunamis, and they have volcano eruptions. And this you really can't get away from unless you move. You're going to live with it. But then on top of that, then we are having the climate related disasters. And on top of that, there is so much urbanization going on in Asia Pacific, but informally, not in a planned way. And what happens if urbanization, if a city just becomes large informally because people come in, then people are building their, not even houses, right? Their shacks in places where they shouldn't. And that becomes another disaster risk. So that's where Asia Pacific is. Africa, traditionally, drought was thought as the biggest disaster risk. It still is. It still is. But even in Africa, many parts of Africa are now hit by cyclones where historically they were not. The pattern of weather is changing in many places in Africa, in South Asia also. And so again, there too, it's been drought plus cyclones and other things. And then we also need to think about conflicts. Now, conflict is not in the Sendai Framework, but think about a country which is very fragile because of many years or even decades of conflict, a lot of poverty. There is no governance system. There is no prevention to disaster. And unfortunately, many countries in Africa are like that. So that compounds. And then let's come back to Europe. As I mentioned, historically, here we were very lucky because there weren't many disasters. But now, as I mentioned, wildfires, floods, even drought is coming here. And also, think about what we call the man-made or human-induced disasters. So I talked about Fukushima, but in Europe, there are quite a few fragile, old nuclear power stations. What do we do with this? Cyber attack. Now, cyber attack is a crime, but it is something that is not standalone. Many infrastructure, as you know, are run with the computed system. And if there's a cyber attack on the infrastructure which provides us with basic service, then we will not have water, we will not have electricity, the economy will stop. So again, there is this combination of things which we call multi-hazard. We are living in a multi-hazard world, and that is what the pandemic has told us. The other thing that the pandemic has told us is that we are living in a world of systemic risk. So the biological hazard, it started as a public health crisis. Now it's a socio-economic crisis. And because everything is connected within a country, but globally also we're so connected, one thing leads to another. This is the nature of risk that we are living, and we do need to acknowledge this.
So now that you have successfully managed and scaring me, and probably everybody in the room, let's talk about how we can solve at least some of these issues. The office you run is tasked with disaster risk reduction.
Right.
And when I look at the list of risks that you just mentioned, and I probably don't even remember all of them, but we had pandemics, and we had volcanoes, and we had earthquakes, and we had tsunamis, and we had climate change in general, and nuclear reactors, and conflicts, and droughts, and cyclones, and the list goes on and on and on, and cyber attacks were in there as well. Yet your office is curiously small.
It is.
So let me ask you, without maybe, forgive me if this is too blunt, but like, how do you do that? How can you reduce the risk of all these disasters with a small office in Geneva?
Yeah, well, thank you very much. We are very small. We're one of the smallest UN agencies. We're only 120 people globally in Geneva and also in the regions. So how do we do it? Risk is everybody's business. This is the answer, which means that we are in the position of supporting, advising, and providing tools and guidance to the governments who are primarily responsible to be more preventative. So it's all about risk governance, isn't it? The pandemic has showed some countries have been better, some countries have not been as successful. So our role is to support these governments so that they have a plan, a strategy for disaster risk reduction in place. But it goes beyond that. When I say risk is everybody's business, and it is written in the Sendai Framework, that we need to have a whole of society approach. So that's what we do a lot. We work in partnership not only with the governments of central governments, but also the cities, the mayors and the governors. We work with the private sector. We work with the civil society. We work with the academia because science is so important for us to understand how we prevent. So our office creates all these networks of partners that work together in dealing with disaster risk. And it's not for me to say whether we are successful or not, but that's how we manage it. Now, the silver lining of this pandemic is that finally more people, not only in governments, but everybody is becoming aware of the importance of prevention, that we should not wait until a hazard becomes a disaster, because when it becomes a disaster, we can only respond, right? And build back better. But we have to anticipate what's coming and be more preventative. And I think that this raised awareness among the citizens themselves will help us not only get through this pandemic, but also deal with other risks.
You mentioned a couple of times already the Sendai Framework, which guides a lot of your work, and which I think is in place from 2015 to 2030. So we're kind of slightly before halfway through this period. And it's sort of comparable in terms of what it is, sort of the type of framework that is comparable to the Paris Agreement. Now, I'm assuming that everybody has heard about the Paris Agreement, maybe has a general idea of what it says. I at least had not heard of the Sendai Framework before. So could you tell us a little bit about what the framework is, what it does, and why you think it's important to have?
Right. So 2015 was a very important year for all of us, because in that year the Paris Agreement was agreed, and what we call the Sustainable Development Goals was agreed. Agenda 2030, it's also called. But Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction was the very first global document that was agreed in that year in March. You probably haven't heard of it for several reasons, because it's a document that guides us on how to prevent better from disaster risk. And prevention, as I mentioned, was never the top of the agenda of many people. Another reason is, while the Paris Agreement is a legal document, the Sendai Framework, it's not a legally binding, what we would call a treaty. It's a document that all member states, 193, adopted by consensus, but it's not legally binding. And I would say that, of course, I scared you with a lot of things, but there's so much that we can take in, right? Climate has been I would say, the big agenda that people have been focusing on. And I think now that we have the pandemic as well, and that all of these things are coming together, I believe that that there will be more focus on disaster risk reduction, which the Sendai Framework is all about. And as I said, it has 7 global targets that will show us whether we achieve to better manage disaster risk before it becomes a disaster. It's about reducing the mortality from disasters, reducing the number of people affected in many ways, including like losing your job or losing your house, reducing the economic loss from disasters, reducing the damage to basic infrastructure and disruption of service that comes from it. At the same time, the other 3 targets are more countries with a national and local plan, a strategy for disaster risk reduction, more international cooperation for disaster risk reduction, and finally, more access to early warning systems and information on disaster risk. How are we doing? We were doing quite well on the mortality front until the pandemic, because early warning system is now becoming better. I talked about the Indian Ocean tsunami. There was no early warning system in 2004, although that region is in the Pacific Ring of Fire. Now there is, and there are many early warning systems which are not only about one hazard, but multi-hazard as well. So we were doing well. Unfortunately, mortality has gone up because of, I think just yesterday or something, the mortality went up to 4 million people from the pandemic. So that is not doing well, but we have to do better, because we know that nothing erodes our lives and the sustainable development like disasters. And this is what the Sendai Framework is telling us.
You mentioned before that Japan is one of the countries that is best or most prepared for disasters.
Right.
So can you tell us, maybe using Japan as an example, how is that measured? So what makes a country well prepared for disasters? What does a country have to do to get there?
So the most important thing is risk governance. So the government has to be aware that they need a legislation first about prevention. And that's what Japan has. In 1956, there was a big typhoon that came, which killed many, many people. And from that moment, Japan decided to have a national legislation that puts disaster risk reduction at the forefront priority of the government. Because if you don't have that one, you don't have a budget of the government. In order to have a budget, you need a legislation, right? So that's number one. Then you need an institution, which also needs to be based on binding legislation, an agency which deals with disaster risk management, not only responding, but also preventing. And then thirdly, you need to have good education, advocacy in the country, so that the people know what are the risks that they are exposed to and what should they be doing in order to be more preventative. So that's also very important. And here kicks in the role or behavior of the citizens, because even if the government puts a law and puts budget against it, if the people are not aware, then it doesn't work. Early warning system is a good example. You can have an early warning system, but if people ignore it, then it doesn't work. So that's why we say early warning, early action, right? But in order to make it happen, you have to have drills at schools, earthquake drills, or drills for other hazards that you are prone to. That's very important. And you need to work with science, like in the case of the pandemic, because we need to understand the scientific issues that relate to the different hazards, the different exposure, the different vulnerability. And we need to understand not only what happened in the past, but what's going to happen now. So this is the importance of what we call the policy science interface. And in countries where you have this better, then you have a better chance of being more preventative. These are some basic things, but I think they're very important, and each country should have this.
During the pandemic, I became familiar with the concept that I think is known as the prevention paradox, which I find very fascinating. Sort of the fact that it's very hard to know if prevention actually works, because it means that something doesn't happen, but then it's very hard to tell if it didn't happen because of prevention or if it wouldn't have happened anyway. And then a lot of people would question, as has often happened during the pandemic, the necessity of the measures since nothing actually happened.
Right.
So your whole job is prevention, and your success in a way is measured by something not happening, which means it's very hard. It's very hard for you to know whether you're successful. So how do you deal with that? How do you deal with the criticism that your work may not be needed anyway, since nothing is happening? And how do you go about measuring the success of your work?
Right. So that's exactly at the core of what we're talking about. There's another way of talking about it. Somebody said the no glory of prevention, and let's be honest, for politicians, this is terrible, right? Because if they put money and resources into something, and because of that, nothing happened, they can't say, oh, I was such a good politician in making this succeed. But let's say, honestly, I think, we are now facing so many disasters, and we know what a disaster, whether it's a pandemic or whether it's related to climate emergency, can do. And so the easiest way to compare is two similar disasters and what happens. There's a good example in Bangladesh in the 1970s. There was a big cyclone that killed, some say, close to 1 million people in one blow. But since then, the government has put in early warning, early action system. And now when a similar level of cyclone comes, and actually it came last year as well, the number of deaths has gone down to less than 1,000. Now, that's still a lot, but if you look at how much it has been decreased, you can say that, yes, if you put in measures, you can save lives. And we have seen a lot of the same kind of things in many different countries. This pandemic will be the same. This is not going to be the last pandemic. As human beings become closer to the wildlife and many pathogens that did not invade the humans are now starting to do it. And it can happen anywhere. And once it happens, it can become a pandemic. So what we need to do is that we need to learn from the lesson of this pandemic and put in the measures that we now are learning that will help to be more preventative and put them in. I think this pandemic hopefully will change the perception of what you just mentioned, right? Because it is a major disaster, and the difference to other disasters is that we are all living it together at the same time. So I do hope that with our advocacy efforts, with our efforts to provide tools and guidance to governments, that we will become more preventative. But I would really like to say that you need political leadership to do this. You need political leaders who are brave or bold enough to say, okay, I'm going to put money and people into this area. And if I'm successful, nothing will happen. Or even if it happens, it's not going to be a disaster. But we need those kind of politicians, and it's only for the citizens to elect those kind of politicians.
One thing that we haven't maybe touched upon so far today is, you've pointed out many times that in order for us to mitigate these risks, manage these risks,
Right.
prevent disaster, we'll need global cooperation.
Right.
These risks are all global,
Yeah.
They're all systemic, so this can only work if we collaborate. And I think one thing that the pandemic has shown is that doesn't work very well. And it seems that there's a lot of the geopolitical friction that we see these days that is increasing, that sort of prevents us from working together. One of my there's a thing that's always being said in Europe, which said, there's many areas where we disagree with China, but at least we can collaborate on climate change. And I fear more and more that that's actually not even that is true. So how would you assess the risk of sort of geopolitical division in preventing us from doing the risk reduction work that you have been pointed out very eloquently today is absolutely necessary?
It's a challenge. We talk a lot about the failure of multilateralism now, and it's true. It's many things that were agreed in 2015 are not being implemented in the way that they should. But on top of that, there are more challenges, including the geopolitical issue that you just mentioned. And it's really, something that the Secretary General is daily, if not hourly, talking about. But I think, there is always hope. I mean, let's think about but it's true. I mean, I joined the UN 3 years ago. I work for the government, and one of the things that I've learned in the UN is that ultimately, if you're not optimistic, or if you don't have a grain of optimism, you can't do this job, because you can talk about everything that's going wrong or not, but that's not going to solve the problem, right? I mean, let's look at now the U.S. administration has come back to the Paris Agreement, has come back to the WHO. Of course, we're not going to ask the U.S. to do everything, because as powerful and important as U.S. is, we need to do it all together. But that's a big plus, right? So there are always challenges and weak spots there. But at the end, we can't give up. And countries like, I really mean this when I say this, Switzerland, many countries in Europe, Sweden, Norway, the Nordic countries, there is really a big principle of the humanitarian, thinking within the government and the people who support the government, which I mean the citizens, that the issues that we are facing is something that we need to solve together. It's not only the pandemic, it's the climate emergency as well. So I do feel that, as long as we have countries like Switzerland, like Sweden, and Japan, which do believe in multilateralism, then we are not giving up. It's the difficulty is that the pace is not quick enough, and the challenges are mounting. But look at the young people, right? They are much more challenging. I wouldn't say optimistic, but also forthcoming about these issues. And I really think that we owe them a lot, because it's their future, it's their planet, and that's what brings us real energy. These young people, because they are looking at the world in a different way. I think they're not everybody maybe, but they're not looking at what is success in your life, what is the important thing in your life, as I did when I was growing up. And they're teaching us that if we don't go that way, it's a real disaster for everybody. So that's where that's a source of optimism that for me.